Today I'd like to talk about our all-flash solutions. So not just all-flash, all NVMe flash. Some of them do have options to use SATA, but you can use NVMe in all the drive bays on the units we'll talk about today. The first one I want to talk about is the brand new TS-h1290FX that's on the screen now. So this is a desktop chassis. The other two we'll talk about are rack mount versions, so if you want them a bit more out the way in a server room, you've got the option with those as well. So the TS-h1290FX is sort of to answer the call for video editors. We get a lot of the creative professionals coming to us where they're trying to use lots of editors with one storage. They want to consolidate everything into one box where possible. So here's just sort of the worst case of what we have to cater for. So if somebody's using an 8K RED camera, for example, 1 hour of footage from that camera is about 7 terabytes in size. If you're wanting to do video editing with it, you have to be capable of doing at least 566 megabytes a second in bandwidth. To sort of translate that into real world terms, that's about half of what a 10 gig port can do, 10 gig Ethernet, 5 gigabit Ethernet ports. So you really do need some nice bandwidth to go into the NAS. And of course you have to multiply that by the number of editors that you have. So if you've got 3 or 4 editors right now, that's a significant chunk of bandwidth that you need the NAS to be capable of delivering from the storage, so that people can edit that footage, work on the footage live from the storage without having to transfer it locally first. The way we can achieve that is just by using much faster CPUs and processors that have a lot of PCIe lanes, which lets us use lots of NVMEs. For those that don't know, NVMEs don't go through things like SATA or SAS controllers, different layers of drivers and things like that. They go direct to the CPU, so you're able to get the performance out at a much lower latency, and it's just much faster all around as well. SATA drive would do about 6 gig a second, for example, and some of the faster Gen 4 PCIe Gen 4 NVMEs these days, they can do about 64 gig a second, so much faster. So throughout the lineup, we've had a lot of different AMD options. A few with the 63 and 73 series. We had the 77 series with the Ryzen. And then we went up all the way to the AMD EPYC, which is a server-grade CPU with really, really high specs. So the most important spec that we like is down at the bottom there, the last bullet point, which is that the CPU supports 128 PCIe Gen 4 lanes. So by supporting that many lanes, we can multiply that or start taking some of those lanes for the different drive bays that we have. So if you have a 24 bay NAS, we're able to split those Gen 4 lanes down into, say, a few Gen 3x4 lanes. Whereas with the smaller 12 bay desktop unit, we're able to keep them Gen 4 throughout. So here's a look at the front view of the NAS itself. So you got your 12 main bays there with the indicator lights on them. All these drive trays are lockable in case you wanted to lock them up for security. You got some USB ports as well, and you've got an LCD status display up there if you need it too. Here's a picture of the rear of the unit. So even with all those PCIe Gen 4x4 lanes allocated to the front of the NAS with the drive bays, you do also have room still in the back for 4 Gen 4 PCIe slots in the rear. So 3 of those are Gen 4x16. One of them is a Gen 4x8. And we've also got a couple of 25 gig LAN ports built right in at the bottom right hand side there. So we've not used up a PCIe slot for the 25 gig ports. They're built right in. And it also still has just a couple of 2.5 gig ports in there for good measure if you want something that works with sort of normal gigabit networks or something a bit slower with standard copper cables. You've got those down there as well. The power supply is also over there on the right hand side. It's a very high efficiency and quiet power supply, so the goal here is to try and keep it as quiet as possible. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. And here's the internal view of the NAS. So down at the bottom left you've got those 3 long slots, which are the faster of the Gen 4 slots, and then you've got the smaller one in slot number 3 there, which is a Gen 4x8. So even though that's a slower slot, the PCIe Gen 4x8 is still an incredibly fast slot. That slot would match the fastest slot we've ever done on any other NAS that we've got, even though it's the slower one here. It's got 8 RAM slots, so you are able to put up to 1 terabyte of RAM in this. That's ECC RAM. And you've also got the option of 16 core 32 thread or 8 core 16 thread options with this device as well. So as I said, you can have up to 1 terabyte of ECC DDR4 RDIMMs in this as well. So if you did want to take it up to a higher level than the 64s or 128s that we make, you do have that option with these as well. So here's a screen showing you the different performance we got. So we tested this performance with 6 25 gig clients concurrently accessing, so 6 different PCs all with a 25 gig connection. And you can see at the top there we've got the IOPS figure, so that would be more important for transactional workloads like somebody running databases or virtual machines from the NAS. But when you see the throughput figure at the bottom, so up to 14,200 megabytes a second on the read and 8,500 megabytes a second on the write. So if you take those figures from earlier of just over 500 megasecond for the 8K read raw footage, you can have a significant number of editors working from this simultaneously if you needed to. And with those PCIe slots, so you might want to put something in there. So we do have options for NVIDIA GPUs as well. We have 100 gig Ethernet options, and whatever you plug in there, if it needs some extra power, we do have some extra power connectors on that power supply. So whether it's 6-pin or 8-pin, we've got the different options. So if you do have a very high power usage need for a GPU in one of those PCIe slots, we can add some extra power into the card rather than just the power that's coming out the PCIe slot. The 25 gig ports do also work at 10 gig, so we'll be seeing this change through our lineup going forward, that a lot of the 10 gig slots will get swapped over to 25 gig. It still works at 10 gig, so if you still need 10 gig SFP+, if you use 10 gig SFP+, DACs or transceivers, those 25 gig ports will still work at 10 gig throughputs. And we've got a range of different accessories as well. We've got some dedicated 10 gig switches, as well as a brand new 25 gig switch there at the bottom. It's got 16 SFP28 slots capable of 25 gig each, and there's one 10 base T on the other side if you need to uplink it to something else. And this is a managed switch as well, so you can do things like port trunking, VLANs, things like that on there. Some other optional extras, so quite a few normal ones, but the one that's sort of down at the bottom in the middle there, the 100 gig Ethernet, that's a dual 100 gig Ethernet NIC, so it's got 2 QSFP28 ports on there. So you're able to really get some performance out of it. It's got the Intel 810 chipset on there as well, so you get a lot of performance using that one. We haven't allowed the 100 gig card to work on anything except the all NVMe flash arrays, simply because there's not enough drives in those to be able to drive those ports with SATA connections, so it's got to be the NVMe units that can get the most out of that card. So here's just a sample workflow of a creative professional type office with lots of people working on different things at once where they all demand high bandwidth. So you can have lots of users connected in directly to a switch. You can have some link aggregation, some port trunking if you like, bonding the ports together to the NAS itself to feed that switch with all the different users. If you do have some users, perhaps with things like a MacBook Pro or an older iMac, something like that, where it doesn't have fast Ethernet built into it with no other real option to upgrade it, we do have a couple of options that allow you to use Thunderbolt 3 connections or higher to convert it into a 10 gig connection. So we do these small, we call them QNAP devices. We do them in both 10 base T as well as SFP+ options for those as well. And so as I mentioned earlier about the noise levels, so when this unit's in standby, really not doing very much. It's only generating about 23 decibels of noise, which is really very quiet. And when it's in full operation, it's still only generating about 30 decibels. So very, very convenient for an office if you're going to have this out in the office where people are working. So now we'll move on to the next unit. Here is the next unit, which is the TS-h2490FU. So we featured this in a couple of videos previously just to show off the 25 gig performance testing, so I won't go into too much details, but this unit's able to deliver very comparative performance to the previous unit we just talked about. So if we jump straight into the two different options we've got here, we've got this available as a 128 gig and 64 gig version. The 128 gig model comes with 16 cores, 32 threads, and you've also got options for a 8 core, 16 thread version. The top one with the 128 gig and the faster CPU does also come with out of the box 4 25 gig ports. whereas the one at the bottom only comes with 2. You can always add more if you need to. So here's a front view of the NAS, not much to do up here, just a few status lights and a power button, but you've got the 24 hot swap bays there. So this NAS can have 24 U.2 Gen 3 by 4 NVMe drives up front as well. So very capable, lots of capacity if you need it. Looking around the back, this is a picture of the one with 128 gig RAM and the faster CPU. So it's got the 4 25 gig ports over there on the left hand side. And you've got 3 spare slots on the right hand side. So we've got some specs there to show you the speeds of the different slots. And it's got the 2 hot swap PSUs at the right hand side. And when you look inside the unit, adding things is very easy. So if you wanted to add more RAM, so this has actually got 16 RAM slots, so it's got a much higher max RAM limit there. So you're able to pull out the tray, just 2 thumb screws. There's a little lever to pull down and it pops straight out the back of the NAS. So even if it's rack mounted, you're able to get in there and change out things like the PCIe things. You don't have to slide it out the front of the rack and take the lid off or anything. You can do it all from the back just by sliding the tray out. Very easy to do. So here's just a bit of labeling to show you all the different things inside. So you've got the 16 ECC DDR4 RAM slots. Again, you've got the specs for each of the individual slots with a few little bits of text written in brackets there. So for example, slot 2 is a Gen 4x4 slot, but when slot 1 is not in use, it's a Gen 4x8. So there's a few of those. So you can get faster slots if you need it just by not populating the slots next to them. So this is how we're splitting up that AMD EPYC CPU. So this also applies to the TS-h1290FX that we already talked about. So this is just able to split the CPU up. Because this one has got more drive bays than the 12 bays, so twice as many drive bays, there wasn't enough PCIe lanes, even with this CPU, to do Gen 4x4 speeds to every single drive bay. So we split it down to Gen 3x4. So you can use faster drives in the 12 bay, you can just use half as many of them. So that's how we're splitting up. But even on this one, you're getting 32 gigabits a second to every single drive, and multiply that by the 24 drives. You're getting some absolutely colossal performance out of the storage. And here's sort of a final slide on this unit as to why we like NVMe. So this sort of really applies to all 3 units as well. At the top left, you've got how SATA SSDs would work, so relatively low bandwidth through a SATA controller with all the different protocols and drivers it needs to get to the CPU. Even SAS gets a bit better, twice as fast with SAS, so it's coming into the CPU from the other way, but it's still got a controller, protocols, drivers, things like that. With NVMe's, there's none of that. There's no controllers. It's just NVMe SSD through the PCIe bus straight to the CPU. Very little in the way, so that improves things like the speed and latency. And you can see a sort of maximum bandwidth there. So SATA will cap out at 600 megabytes a second. SAS will do 1200 megabytes a second. And on this particular unit, the NVMe will cap out at 4000 megabytes a second, but that's actually going to be 8000 megabytes a second. On the H1290FX that we talked about first. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. This is the final unit I wanted to talk about today, so slight departure from the previous 2. This one is an Intel-based one instead of AMD. So this is the TDS-h2489FU, and this one uses Intel Xeon CPUs. So yeah, plural. It's got 2 Intel Xeon Silver CPUs in here. So we're using the 2 CPUs to try and make it even faster, to try and get the performance quite similar to that of the AMD EPYC CPU. So it's an all-flash unit. So on the front, you've got the same 24 drive bays. All 24 bays can be used with U.2 NVMe. The last 8 bays can also be used, so the ones on the right hand side there, they can also have SATA drives in as well. So you can have 16 NVMe's, and you could have some SATA SSDs. So maybe you wanted some lower cost, larger SSDs in there for some extra capacity. You do have that option on this unit here as well. So there's just a brief overview of all the different specs and what you can use it with, but it's a very, very capable unit with the 2 Xeon CPUs. So a bit more on those Xeons. So they're the latest Intel Xeon Silvers, so you've got a couple of different options, either 8-core 16-thread or 16-core 32-thread. So really efficient, really high performance CPUs. So you're able to get a lot of bandwidth through these ones as well. And this is using 2 CPUs. For those that want to stick with the Intel based architecture. From the front, so this is what it looks like. Slight different from the previous rack one. This one has an OLED display on the left hand side, so it gives you a bit of information, things like model number, IP address, temperatures, things like that. So you can get a basic bit of information from that screen up front. And here you can see a bit more clearly. We've got a little bit of labeling basically above drive base 17 that has arrows to the right that says NVMe or SATA from that moment on. So you can use NVMe's there if you want, have all 24 bays, but you do also have an option there to use some SATA in this one. Looking at the back of the NAS, it's again quite similar to the previous one, 2 thumb screws so that you can pop the tray out, but around the back you've got the 2 PCI Express slots. One is pre-populated with a dual port 25 gig NIC, but there is another slot so that you can add something else in there, so it's a Gen 4x16 slot, so long as nothing's in the other slot. If something is in the other slot, then it will be a Gen 4x8. So that's how we're using the back of this unit. It's a bit tidier than the other one, but there's not as many PCIe lanes to play with here. So a quick look at the inside of the NAS itself. So it shows you all the different things with everything labeled up. So you've got the 2 really beefy PSUs there. So if you wanted to put a graphics card or something in one of those PCIe slots, there's a lot of power available for a really power-hungry GPU that could go in there as well. So hopefully that's given you an idea of our all-flash solutions. So that's the 3 units I wanted to talk about, which was first the TS-h1290FX, which was the 12-bay desktop chassis. We've got the TS-h2490FU, which is the 24-bay based off the same AMD EPYC as the desktop version. And we've got the brand new TDS-h2489FU, and that one is the dual Intel Xeon Silver CPU. Again, you got 24 U.2 bays on this one, just like the AMD EPYC one, but this one you can also use SATA if you wish, and that's not an option on the AMD EPYC rack version. And if anybody has any questions, please do let us know in the comments section down below, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks a lot. Bye.